The wind, a thin, keening sound, scoured the dust from the parched yard, swirling it against the weathered planks of Elias Thorne's cabin. It was a lonely sound, the only constant companion he'd known since the silence had fallen heavy as a shroud over the small homestead. He stood on the porch, a silhouette carved from dusk and disappointment, watching the distant shimmer on the horizon that was supposed to resolve into Henderson's wagon, bringing the cook he'd reluctantly sent for. Mrs. Peterson, the letter had said, stout, capable, and, most importantly, willing to work for keep and a meager wage at the edge of nowhere. His hands, gnarled and calloused from years of wresting a life from this unforgiving land, clenched on the porch rail. The stove inside was cold, the coffeepot empty. His meals had become a grim ritual of hardtack and jerky, a penance for a life that felt hollowed out. The shimmer resolved itself not into the sturdy form of Henderson's freight wagon, but into a smaller, more desperate shape, a lone figure stumbling along the rutted track, too small, too frail to be the woman he expected. Elias squinted, his gaze sharpening. It was a girl, or barely a woman, clutching a meager bundle to her chest. Her dress was torn, stained with the grime of long travel, and she moved with a peculiar, swaying gait that spoke of utter exhaustion. As she drew closer, his breath caught. She was young, her face a pale oval beneath a fall of lank, dark hair, eyes wide and haunted like a startled deer's. And she was with child, heavily so. He saw it in the swell beneath the threadbare fabric, the protective curve of her arm. He'd seen that look on Sarah, that inward gaze of a woman carrying life. The comparison struck him like a physical blow, a fresh stab of an old, unhealed wound. This was not Mrs. Peterson. This was a wraith, a fugitive from some unseen sorrow, blown to his doorstep by the same cruel wind that gnawed at his eaves. She stopped a few yards from the porch, swaying, her breath coming in shallow rasps. Her eyes, shadowed with a terror that went deeper than mere fatigue, fixed on him, unblinking. She didn't speak. He said nothing, the words of inquiry dying in his throat. What was there to ask that wasn't already written on her ravaged face? The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and the vast, indifferent hum of the plains. He thought of Sarah's empty garden, the small, hopeful shoot she'd coaxed from the stubborn soil, now choked with weeds. He thought of the cradle in the loft, gathering dust, a monument to a future that had never arrived. This girl, this child-woman, was an aberration, a disruption to the sterile order of his grief. Yet, there was something in her profound vulnerability that disarmed the harshness he'd cultivated. He'd waited for a cook, a practical solution to a practical problem. He'd received a wound, raw and bleeding, laid bare before him. He grunted, a sound that was neither welcome nor dismissal, and turned, the screen door groaning in protest as he pushed it open. He moved towards the cold stove, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He could feel her gaze on his back, a palpable weight. He did not look back. He busied himself with the kindling, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the sudden storm of her arrival. The scrape of the match, the hesitant flicker of flame, these were known things. Her presence was not. After a long moment, he heard the faintest creak of the porch boards, then the whisper of the screen door opening and closing, so softly he might have imagined it. He did not turn. He simply added another log to the nascent fire, the scent of pine pitch a sharp, clean counterpoint to the stale air of the cabin, an air now subtly changed, charged with a new, unwelcome, and undeniable life. The water for coffee, when he finally poured it, seemed to hiss with a different note. The town, what little there was of it, would talk. He knew that. Another burden for a man already carrying too many. But the girl was here, a shadow in the corner of his kitchen, and the wind outside seemed to howl a little louder, as if acknowledging the shift in the desolate landscape of his life. He found her, later, huddled on the worn rag rug before the hearth, not asleep but utterly still, her eyes fixed on the flames. He placed a tin plate of warmed beans and a piece of day-old bread beside her. She didn't look at him. She didn't move. He retreated to his own chair, the silence pressing in, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the unsteady rhythm of her breathing. He wondered what demons chased her, what brought her to this precipice. He wondered, with a cold dread, what she carried within her beyond the obvious. For a moment, her eyes met his across the flickering light, and in their depths, he saw not just fear, but a desolation that mirrored his own. Then she looked away, her hand instinctively going to her belly. He nodded, once, a curt, almost imperceptible movement. It was not acceptance, not yet. It was merely an acknowledgement of her presence. Of the storm that had just broken over his threshold. The days that followed settled into a strange, silent rhythm. Elias rose before dawn, the chill of the high plains seeping through the cabin walls. He'd find her already awake, or perhaps she never truly slept, a still figure on the rug, her eyes open to the grey light. He would build the fire, make coffee, strong and black. He'd leave a portion for her, along with whatever food he prepared, usually biscuits, hard and serviceable, or reheated beans. She ate sparingly, almost furtively, when she thought he wasn't looking, though he was always looking. He watched her the way a man watches a wild thing, cornered and unpredictable. Her fear was a constant presence, a scent in the air like ozone before a lightning strike. She flinched if he moved too suddenly, her eyes darting to the door as if poised for flight, though there was nowhere for her to run. The vast, empty plains offered no sanctuary. He learned her name, or what he presumed was her name, from a scrap of paper that fell from her bundle when she'd first collapsed inside. Leah, it read, in a spidery, uncertain script, nothing more. He never used it. She never spoke it. She never spoke at all. Her silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable. He made no attempt to breach it. Words had always been difficult for him, and now, in the face of her profound trauma, they seemed utterly inadequate. Instead, he communicated through action, the language he understood. He mended the loose hinge on the cabin door, the grating sound of it setting her teeth on edge. He patched the roof where a shingle had come loose, the rhythmic tap of his hammer a counterpoint to the mournful sigh of the wind. He worked his small, fallow fields, clearing the stubborn rocks, turning the earth, though the season for planting was long past. It was a habit, a need to impose order on a chaotic world. Sometimes, from the corner of his eye, he would see her watching him from the cabin window, a pale face in the dusty glass. She began, tentatively, to move about the cabin. Small, almost imperceptible shifts. One morning, he found the tin plates washed, stacked neatly by the dry sink. Another day, the rug was shaken out, the crumbs swept from the hearth. She did these things when he was outside, her movements quick and silent, like a ghost tending to the needs of the living. He said nothing. He simply observed the changes, the small encroachments of domesticity into the starkness of his widower's existence. The empty cradle in the loft became a looming presence in his thoughts. Sarah had stitched the lining herself, tiny blue flowers on a field of white. He hadn't been able to bring himself to look at it, not really, since she died. Now, its image floated before him as he worked, as he sat in the evening silence. Twins. The thought had occurred to him with a jolt when he'd first seen the sheer size of her, the way she carried the burden. He'd seen it before, on a neighbor's wife years ago. The possibility added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Henderson, the wagon master, eventually rumbled up to the cabin a week later, his face a mixture of apology and curiosity. Elias. Heard you got company. Different than expected, Elias just grunted, taking the small sack of coffee beans and flour Henderson offered. Mrs. Peterson took ill. Sent word last minute. Henderson's eyes flickered towards the cabin, where Leah was no doubt hidden, invisible. This one, she ain't from around here, no, Elias said, his voice flat. Anything else, Henderson? Henderson, sensing the stone wall, shrugged. Just supplies. Town's buzzing, though. You know how it is. Our Elias knew. The community, such as it was, all a handful of scattered homesteads and the dusty collection of buildings that called itself Redemption Gulch, would be alive with speculation. A lone man, a pregnant girl appearing from nowhere. Their imaginations would fill in the sordid details. He didn't care for their gossip, but he knew it could turn mean, could bring trouble he wasn't prepared for. One evening, as a chill wind whipped around the cabin, presaging an early autumn, he found a small, mended tear in his work shirt laid out on his cot. The stitches were tiny, neat, almost invisible. Sarah had sewn like that. He picked up the shirt, the rough fabric suddenly soft in his calloused hand. He looked towards the corner where Leah sat, her head bowed over some unseen task in her lap, perhaps another small act of mending. Her hands, he noticed, were chapped and raw, but they moved with a delicate precision. He said nothing. He merely hung the shirt on its peg, the small, repaired patch facing inwards. The silence in the cabin that night felt different, less like a void and more like a held breath. He found himself listening for the soft sounds of her movements, the almost inaudible sigh of her breath. The fear was still there, in the air, in her eyes, but beneath it, something else was stirring, something fragile and tentative, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground. He wondered if this was what healing felt like, not a grand pronouncement, but a series of small, mended things. The whispers from Redemption Gulch grew louder, carried on the autumn wind like dry leaves skittering across the hardpan. Elias heard them when he went for supplies, the way conversations died when he entered Miller's Mercantile, the way eyes followed him, cold and assessing. Martha Miller, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose face was a roadmap of prairie hardships and quiet wisdom, was the only one who met his gaze directly. Her own held a measure of concern, perhaps, but no judgment. "She keeping well?" Martha had asked once, her voice low as she weighed out his flour. Elias had just nodded. "Babies need things," Martha had continued, almost to herself, her gaze distant. "Old Mercy down the hollow, she's a midwife." If the time comes sudden, he'd nodded again, the words lodging in his chest like stones. He knew about Mercy, a reclusive woman rumored to possess knowledge of herbs and birthing. The thought of Leah's time, of the inevitable crisis it would bring, was a constant, dull ache in the back of his mind. He'd begun to make small, almost unconscious preparations. He'd cleared a space in the corner of the main room, near the stove where it was warmest. He'd even, one afternoon, found himself in the loft, his hand resting on the dusty frame of Sarah's cradle. The blue flowered lining was faded, but intact. He'd run his thumb over the tiny, perfect stitches. The memory of Sarah, her laughter, the hope they'd shared, washed over him, so potent it nearly buckled his knees. He'd retreated from the loft, shaken, the cradle remaining untouched, yet its presence now filled the small cabin. Leah's pregnancy advanced visibly, her movements becoming slower, more deliberate. There were days she barely rose from the rug, her face pale and drawn. He would leave food and water within her reach, his gestures brusque to cover the unfamiliar surge of protectiveness he felt. She still didn't speak, but her eyes, when they met his, held a different quality now. The stark terror had softened, replaced by a deep weariness, and sometimes, a flicker of something that might have been a hesitant trust. Or perhaps it was just resignation. He couldn't be sure. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the tightening of her lips, the way her hand would press against her side. These were her only communications, a silent language of impending motherhood. One blustery afternoon, a shadow fell across the threshold. It wasn't Henderson. This man was tall and whip-thin, dressed in town clothes that looked out of place against the raw backdrop of the plains. His face was narrow, his eyes like chips of obsidian, cold and sharp. He had an air of predatory stillness. "I'm looking for a girl," the man said, his voice smooth, but with an underlying current of menace. "Goes by Leah. Dark hair." With child Elias, who had been splitting wood near the porch, slowly lowered his axe. He didn't turn fully, but his body tensed. He could feel Leah's presence inside the cabin, a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a rustle of movement, then a dead stillness. "No one here by that name," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. The man's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She's mine. Indentured. Ran off with something that don't belong to her." He took a step closer. "Named Silas Blackwood. Perhaps you've heard of me." Elias had heard whispers of a man named Blackwood, a gambler and trafficker in human misery from a settlement further west, a place where the law was a suggestion rather than a rule. "Don't know him." "Don't know her," Elias repeated, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond Blackwood's shoulder. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "She's carrying my property. I aim to have it back." And her, he gestured vaguely towards the cabin. I know she's in there. I can smell the fear. Elias took a slow step, positioning himself more fully between Blackwood and the cabin door. The axe handle felt solid in his grip. This is my land. You're trespassing now, Blackwood said, his voice still smooth, but the menace was closer to the surface. No need for unpleasantness. I just want what's mine. Perhaps a small reward for her keep these past weeks. Elias said nothing. His silence was more potent than any threat. Blackwood studied him for a long moment, his gaze flicking from Elias's impassive face to the axe, then back to the cabin. She's not worth dying for, old man. Get off my land, Elias said, his voice a low rumble. For another stretched heartbeat, neither man moved. The wind whistled through the eaves, a mournful counterpoint to the tense standoff. Then, with a curt, dismissive laugh, Blackwood turned. I'll be back, he called over his shoulder. And I'll bring friends. You can't hide her forever. Elias watched him until he was a receding speck on the horizon. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He turned towards the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. In the sliver of darkness, he saw a flash of her eyes, wide and luminous. He didn't go in immediately. He resumed splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a declaration of intent, a warding off. When he finally entered the cabin, dusk was settling. Leah was back on her rug, but she wasn't still. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She looked up as he entered, and for the first time, her eyes held not just fear but a desperate appeal. He nodded, a single, sharp movement. He understood. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a name, a face. And it was coming back. That night, he didn't sleep in his cot. He dragged an old horse blanket to the floor by the door, the shotgun loaded and resting beside him. He listened to the wind, to the creaks of the cabin, to the soft, troubled breathing of the woman in the corner. He was no longer just a widower in a lonely cabin. He was a guardian. And the storm was gathering. The days after Blackwood's visit were taut with an unspoken dread. Every gust of wind, every distant coyote howl, seemed to carry the echo of his threat. Elias found himself scanning the horizon more frequently, his hand often straying to the shotgun propped near the door. Leah, too, was changed. The tentative calm she had begun to acquire was shattered, replaced by a heightened state of anxiety. She moved like a phantom, starting at every unexpected sound, her eyes constantly darting towards the windows, the door. Her silence, once a shield, now felt like a suffocating blanket of fear. Yet, within that fear, a new resolve seemed to harden in Elias. He had made a silent promise, not to her, but to himself, to the memory of Sarah, to whatever shred of decency remained in this harsh world. He would protect this girl, these unborn children. He began to reinforce the cabin. He secured the shutters more firmly, checked the door latch, ensuring it was strong. He even, in a moment of grim practicality, dug a small root cellar under the floorboards in the far corner, a place to hide if the worst came to pass. He worked with a quiet intensity, his movements economical and purposeful. Leah watched him, her gaze unwavering. She didn't offer to help, not with words, but sometimes he would find a tool he needed placed neatly to hand, or a dipper of fresh water left beside his work. Small, silent gestures of acknowledgement, perhaps even alliance. One afternoon, as a storm gathered in the west, mirroring the turmoil in their lives, he finally ascended to the loft. The air was thick with dust and disuse. He walked to the cradle, Sarah's cradle. He ran his hand over the smooth, worn wood. With a deep breath, he lifted it. It was lighter than he remembered, or perhaps he was stronger. He carried it down the narrow ladder, a strange procession into the main room. Leah, who had been staring out the window at the approaching storm, turned as he entered. Her eyes widened, first at the cradle, then at his face. He said nothing. He placed the cradle near the hearth, in the space he had cleared. He wiped it down with a damp cloth, the faded blue flowers in the lining appearing a little brighter. He then went outside and returned with an armful of Sarah's old quilts, stored in a cedar chest. He chose the softest one, a patchwork of faded calico, and folded it carefully into the cradle. 2 lives. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she carried 2. The cradle suddenly seemed too small, yet impossibly large in its significance. Leah approached slowly, hesitantly, as if drawn by an invisible thread. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the edge of the cradle, her fingers tracing the carved wood. Her gaze was fixed on the soft lining, the small space that would soon hold new life. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was the first overt display of emotion he had seen from her, beyond fear. She looked up at him, her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she simply nodded, a slow, profound acknowledgement that transcended language. The storm broke then, the sky unleashing a torrent of rain and wind that battered the small cabin. The light inside grew dim, the only illumination coming from the fire Elias built high in the hearth. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the shutters, testing the strength of their small fortress. And then, Leah gasped. A sharp, indrawn breath. She clutched her belly, her face contorting in a spasm of pain. Her eyes, wide and terrified, sought his. Now, he mouthed, the word lost in the roar of the storm. She nodded, her breath coming in ragged pants. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Elias. Mercy, the midwife, was miles away, across a landscape now impassable. There would be no help from the town, no Martha Miller with her calm experience. They were alone. Utterly alone. He moved to her side, his mind racing. He remembered snippets of conversations from his youth, things Sarah had told him, things he'd overheard. It was a jumble of half-forgotten lore, wholly inadequate for the reality confronting him. Water, he managed, his voice hoarse. Hot water. Linens. He stoked the fire, set the largest kettle to boil, his hands clumsy but driven by a desperate urgency. He pulled clean rags from their meager store, his thoughts a chaotic whirl. Leah cried out again, a low moan that was swallowed by the storm. He knelt beside her, taking her hand. It was cold, clammy. Her knuckles were white where she gripped his. Breathe, he said, the word rough. Just breathe. He didn't know what else to say. He was a farmer, a mender of fences and plows, not a bringer of life. The hours that followed were a blur of pain, fear, and a strange, primal intensity. The storm raged outside, a symphony of chaos, while inside the small cabin, a different kind of battle was being fought. Elias did what he could, guided by instinct and Leah's raw, animalistic efforts. He wiped her brow, offered her sips of water, spoke words of encouragement he didn't feel, his voice a low murmur against the backdrop of her cries. And then, amidst the fury of the storm and the crucible of birth, a small, wet, wailing miracle. A boy. Tiny, perfect, his cry a defiant challenge to the harsh world he'd entered. Elias, his hands shaking, cleaned the infant as best he could, wrapping him in a piece of Sarah's softest linen. He laid the baby on Leah's chest. Her eyes, dazed and exhausted, focused on the small bundle. A faint smile touched her lips. But it wasn't over. Another wave of pain racked her body. Elias's heart pounded. Twins. He'd been right. The second birth was quicker, harder, as if the world was impatient. Another cry, this one fainter, but just as determined. A girl. Smaller than her brother, but fierce. He tended to her, his movements more practiced now, though his heart was a wild drum against his ribs. He laid her beside her brother. Leah wept then, silent tears of exhaustion, relief, and a pain that went deeper than the physical. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. A pale, watery dawn was breaking, casting a grey light into the cabin. Elias slumped against the wall, utterly drained. He looked at Leah, at the 2 tiny infants nestled against her. A profound sense of awe, tinged with an almost unbearable sorrow for all that had been lost and all that had just been found, washed over him. Leah's eyes met his. And then, she spoke. Her voice was a mere whisper, cracked and hoarse, but it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "Thank you," she breathed. Just 2 words. But they held a universe of meaning. He could only nod, his throat too tight for speech. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The 2 babies stirred, their tiny mouths seeking. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, in the fragile light of a new day, something had irrevocably shifted. The silence in the cabin was no longer one of fear or desolation. It was a silence filled with the tiny, demanding sounds of new life, a silence that held the promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. The weeks that followed the twins' birth unfolded in a rhythm of exhaustion and quiet wonder. Elias learned the contours of this new life, so different from the stark solitude he had inhabited. The cabin, once a monument to his grief, was now filled with the constant, demanding presence of the infants of a boy, whom Leah quietly named Samuel, after a brother she'd lost, and a girl, whom Elias, after much internal deliberation, found himself calling Hope. Leah had simply nodded when he'd first used the name, a soft acceptance in her tired eyes. He hadn't known where the name came from, only that it felt right, a small beacon in the vastness of their changed landscape. Leah recovered slowly. She was weak, but a fierce, protective maternal instinct burned in her. She tended to Samuel and Hope with a devotion that was both tender and resolute. Elias took on the tasks she couldn't manage, hauling water, chopping endless stacks of wood for the constantly burning fire, cooking meals that were simple but nourishing. He learned to move quietly, to anticipate the baby's needs, to interpret their different cries. He even, to his own surprise, found a strange solace in rocking one of them to sleep in Sarah's cradle while Leah nursed the other. The cradle, once a symbol of his loss, was now a vessel of fragile, tenacious life. He had mended it further, reinforcing a loose spindle, smoothing a rough edge. It was a small act, but it felt significant. He was mending more than just a piece of furniture. He was mending pieces of himself. The threat of Silas Blackwood still loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon. Elias remained vigilant, his shotgun always within reach. He knew Blackwood was not a man to forget a perceived slight or abandon a valuable asset. He expected him to return, especially now, knowing the children had been born. He rationed their supplies carefully, venturing to Redemption Gulch only when absolutely necessary. The townsfolk were, as expected, abuzz. Martha Miller, however, proved to be a quiet ally. On one of his rare trips for flour and salt, she had pressed a small bundle into his hands. For the little ones, she'd said, her gaze kind. Inside were knitted caps and soft woolen blankets. Mercy sends her good wishes. She heard. The wind carries news, even to her hollowed. Elias had merely grunted his thanks, but a warmth spread through his chest. Not everyone was judgmental. Not everyone was unkind. One crisp morning, as the last of the autumn leaves clung to the cottonwoods by the dry creek bed, he saw a dust cloud in the distance. Not Henderson's familiar plume. This was different, faster, more purposeful. His gut tightened. He moved quickly, barring the door, checking the shutters. He handed Leah the old, heavy pistol he kept loaded in a drawer, its metal cold and purposeful. Her hand was surprisingly steady as she took it. Her eyes, fixed on his, were no longer filled with terror but with a grim determination. "The cellar," he said, his voice low. "Take them." She didn't hesitate. Gathering the sleeping infants, she disappeared beneath the trapdoor he had prepared, pulling it shut behind her. The silence in the cabin was suddenly absolute, heavy. Elias took up his position by the window, the shotgun resting easily in his hands. Blackwood arrived, not alone this time, but with 2 rough-looking men, their faces hard, their eyes mercenary. They fanned out, flanking him as he approached the cabin. "Thorne." Blackwood's voice was sharp, impatient. "I know you're in there. And I know she's had the brats. Hand them over. Her, and the children." "No one needs to get hurt." Elias remained silent, his gaze steady. "Don't be a fool, Thorne. They're not yours. She's not yours." The venom in Blackwood's voice was palpable. "You're harboring stolen property. That's a crime. Elias raised the shotgun slightly, its twin barrels a clear statement. This is my property, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. And you're not welcome on it, Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You and what army, old man? He gestured to his companions. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. One of Blackwood's men, impatient, took a step towards the porch. Elias didn't hesitate. He fired, not at the man, but into the dirt at his feet. The explosion of the shotgun blast shattered the morning quiet, the buckshot kicking up a spray of dust. The man jumped back, his face paling. That was a warning, Elias said, his voice cold as the steel in his hands. The next one won't miss. Blackwood's face darkened with rage. You'll pay for this, Thorn. You can't protect them forever. For a long moment, there was a standoff. The sun beat down. The only sound was the distant caw of a crow. Elias could feel the sweat trickling down his back, but his hands were steady. He thought of Leah and the twins, hidden beneath the floorboards, their fragile lives dependent on his resolve. He thought of Sarah, of the promises he'd made to her, to himself. He would not yield. Perhaps Blackwood saw something in Elias's eyes, some unshakable conviction, or perhaps he simply decided the price was too high for what he sought. With a curse, he signaled to his men. This isn't over, he snarled, backing away. I'll see you hang for this. They remounted their horses and rode off, their departure as sudden as their arrival, leaving behind only dust and the lingering scent of gunpowder. Elias waited until they were long out of sight before he lowered the shotgun. His arms ached, his body thrummed with adrenaline. He unbarred the door and opened the trapdoor. Leah emerged, her face pale but composed, the baby still sleeping, oblivious in her arms. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. He simply nodded. Gone, he said. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for days, for weeks. She sagged against the doorframe, the relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. It wasn't the silence of fear or the silence of grief. It was a silence of peace, hard-won and precious. Leah sat by the fire, nursing hope, while Samuel slept soundly in the cradle. Elias watched them, the firelight casting a warm glow on their faces. He felt a sense of rightness, a sense of purpose he hadn't known since Sarah's death. The land around them was still harsh, the future uncertain. But within the walls of their small cabin, something new had taken root. Something strong. Something resilient. He had waited for a cook. He had received a storm, a battle, and then, unexpectedly, a family. And in protecting them, he had found his own redemption. The wind whispered around the eaves, but tonight, it sounded less like a lament and more like a lullaby. The departure of Blackwood did not, as Elias had half expected, signal an immediate return to idyllic peace. There was an edge to the quiet now, a lingering awareness of the world's capacity for cruelty. But with each passing day that Blackwood did not return, a layer of tension peeled away, replaced by the mundane, demanding rhythms of life with two infants. The seasons turned. The harshness of late autumn gave way to the biting cold of winter. Snow blanketed the plains, isolating them further, but also creating a sense of a world drawn inward, a cocoon around their small, flickering flame of existence. Elias and Leah fell into a routine born of necessity and unspoken understanding. He hunted, trapped, and kept the woodpile high, his days spent in the frozen landscape, his thoughts often on the warmth and burgeoning life within the cabin. She managed the hearth, the mending, the endless cycle of feeding and comforting the twins. Her silence remained, for the most part, but it was no longer the silence of trauma. It was a quieter, more contemplative silence, broken by soft hums to the babies, or a murmured word of instruction or observation to Elias. Words were still sparse between them, but they were no longer needed to convey the essentials. A shared glance across the cabin, a nod, a gesture, these were their currency of communication. He learned the subtle cadence of her moods, the way her brow furrowed when Samuel was fretful, the soft smile that touched her lips when hope gurgled contentedly. He saw the strength in her, a resilience forged in fires he could only imagine. He saw the fierce love she bore her children, a love that was a shield against the world's harshness. One particularly cold evening, with a blizzard raging outside, Leah was trying to soothe a colicky Samuel. Her face was etched with exhaustion. Elias, without a word, took the crying infant from her arms. He paced the small cabin, humming a tuneless melody, the same one he'd unconsciously hummed to soothe Sarah during her brief illness. Slowly, Samuel's cries subsided, his small body relaxing against Elias's chest. Leah watched them, her head tilted, a strange, soft expression on her face. When Samuel was finally asleep, Elias gently laid him in the cradle beside Hope. He turned to find Leah looking at him, her eyes luminous in the firelight. "You are a good man, Elias Thorne," she whispered, the words so soft he almost didn't catch them. It was the first time she had spoken his full name. It was the first time she had offered a direct sentiment, an observation that went beyond the immediate needs of the day. He felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire. He could only nod, his throat thick. He had never considered himself good. He was a man who had endured, who had survived. But perhaps, in the crucible of these past months, something had been forged anew. News of Blackwood's retreat, and Elias's stand, eventually filtered back to Redemption Gulch, likely carried by Blackwood's own disgruntled men or by travelers who had encountered them. The town's perception of Elias began to shift. The gossip didn't entirely cease, but its tone changed. There was less judgment, more grudging respect. When he next visited Miller's Mercantile, Henderson clapped him on the shoulder. "Heard you saw off Blackwood." Good riddance. Even old man Hemlock, the town's curmudgeon, gave him a curt nod that might have been approval. Martha Miller smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "The little ones are thriving, I trust?" she asked. "They are," Elias confirmed. "She named the girl Hope," he added, surprised at his own willingness to share this small detail. Martha's smile widened. "A fitting name," she said softly. "This land needs more of it." Spring arrived eventually, hesitant at first, then bursting forth with a ferocity that mirrored the tenacity of life itself. The snows melted, the plains turned green, and wildflowers dotted the landscape with improbable color. Elias began to work the land in earnest, clearing the garden plot Sarah had loved. To his surprise, one morning he found Leah there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, Hope bundled at her breast, Samuel asleep in a makeshift sling on her back. She was carefully pulling weeds, her movement slow but determined. He watched her for a moment, the sun warm on his back. He said nothing, but went to fetch another hoe. They worked side by side, the silence companionable, punctuated by the gurgles of the babies and the sounds of the earth yielding to their efforts. They planted beans and squash, corn and potatoes, the seeds holding the promise of a future harvest. The empty chair at his table no longer felt quite so empty. The cabin, once a place of stark grief, now echoed with the small sounds of a growing family. The patched quilt in the cradle, the mended fence, the newly turned earth in the garden, these were testaments to a quiet healing, a slow-burn redemption. The community, in its cautious way, began to extend tendrils of acceptance. Neighbors would occasionally stop by, offering a share of a recent kill or seeking Elias's help with a broken wagon wheel. They would nod to Leah, their curiosity tempered now with a measure of respect for the woman who had survived so much, for the family that Elias was so clearly protecting. And so, life settled into a new pattern, one of quiet domesticity, of shared labor and unspoken affection. The scars of the past remained, for both Elias and Leah, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were reminders of battles fought and survived, of losses endured and new beginnings forged. The wind still whispered across the plains, but now it carried different stories, stories of resilience, of unexpected grace, of a widower who had waited for a cook and found a family, of a traumatized girl who had sought refuge and found a home. And reader, if you have ever stood at the precipice of despair, if you have ever felt the weight of a silence too heavy to bear, then you know the profound power of a single, unexpected flicker of light. You understand that sometimes, the greatest strength is found not in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet, tenacious act of mending what is broken, of planting seeds in barren ground, of opening your door, and your heart, to the storms that bring not just devastation, but the cleansing rain that allows new life to bloom. For in the harshest landscapes, both of the earth and of the soul, hope, like the most resilient wildflower, can indeed find a way to take root and flourish.